Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us on today's panel on cultural burning and prescribed fire policy. We're joined by a panel of really esteemed agency folks and tribal representatives today to talk about the practice of cultural burning and how we are working to expand it, in particularly with a California focus. I wanted to start by just going over some of the desired outcomes for our panel today. I'll first introduce myself. My name is Sarah Clark. I'm an attorney at Shute, Mahaly & Weinberger, which is a public interest law firm located in San Francisco. I've been working on prescribed fire issues for about the last 5 years, helping nonprofit organizations and tribes address issues related to liability and permitting and governance, and worked most recently this past year on a report, Good Fire, which focuses on some of the barriers to cultural burning. Today in our panel, we will be looking at how to build a common understanding about what cultural burning is and the ways that it may be similar and not similar to typical prescribed fire activities. We'll be identifying some of the barriers that prevent an expanded use of cultural burning on the landscape, and hopefully identify some of the solutions to enable greater conditions for cultural burning. And then finally, we'll be working to foster relationships between tribal, federal, state, and nonprofit organizations around cultural and prescribed burning in order to enhance opportunities to engage in implementing some of these solutions. There's a lot of conversation around cultural burning and prescribed fire happening throughout California, and I think this panel today is hopefully just a continuation of some of the dialogue. So I am very pleased to have all of you with us and look forward to a lively discussion. So first, I'd like to have folks go around and introduce themselves. And we will start with Denise Scott.
Hi, thank you. My name is Denise Scott, and I'm the policy lead for the Exceptional Events Program in EPA's Office of Air Quality Planning and Standards, located in Durham, North Carolina. And the Exceptional Events Program is a program that the Clean Air Act allows air agencies to request exceedance data, and which is beyond the agency's control. When those occur, they're called exceptional events. They can be natural events like wildfire, or they can be man-made events that are unlikely to recur at the same type and location. And those would be things like prescribed fire would be not a natural event, excuse me. And while it's clear that prescribed fire is covered under the Exceptional Events Program, it is cultural burns are not, and specifically called out in the rule. And so I'm here today. I hope to learn a lot and to potentially follow up with our attorneys to see if there's some way cultural burning can be considered under the Exceptional Events Program. Thank you.
Thank you, Denise. Over to Michael.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Michael Benjamin. I'm Chief of the Air Quality Planning and Science Division at the California Air Resources Board. So CARB works very closely with the 35 local air districts in California to make sure that we attain the federal ambient air quality standards for pollutants like ozone and fine particulate. And my division and group works with the 35 local air districts in a number of different ways. We work with them in developing their air quality plans for attaining the standards. We work with them on assessing exceptional events and determining whether fires fall under EPA's exceptional events guidance. We also have responsibilities for overseeing smoke management plans that the districts develop along with burners to ensure that burns can be permitted. We also forecast no burn days. And we also work with the air districts and with burners and with local communities in deploying air monitors to ensure that citizens and communities are not exposed to unhealthful levels of smoke. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, Michael. Matthew, over to you.
Well, hello. Thank you for having me. My name is Matthew Reichman. I'm the Deputy Director for Resource Management with CAL FIRE. Those that may not know, CAL FIRE is the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection. We are both the state's forestry department and fire department rolled into one agency. And so my responsibilities are to oversee the forestry side of the department. We have several programs geared toward fuel reduction and vegetation management, striving towards forest health and forest resilience. We have a pretty significant fire issue here in California, and we see prescribed fire being a tool that we can use to help create resilient forests. And ultimately, we've been very effective at putting fire out, but we have a lot to learn when it comes to prescribed fire, to be honest with you. And I think having the opportunity to work with tribes across the state in order to get a better understanding of what cultural burning is, and being able to bring that back to our troops so that we have a greater understanding and appreciation for the different ways that fire can be used on the landscape. So excited to be here, and excited to learn what I can and bring back to my department. So thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Next up, Tony.
Hey, can you hear me okay, Sarah?
Yep.
Okay. Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tony Scardino. I'm the Deputy Regional Forester for the Pacific Southwest region of the USDA Forest Service. So that covers California, Hawaii, and the Pacific Islands, and the 18 national forests and 20 million acres in California. And the two primary programs that I oversee, one is what we call state and private forestry, which is a program where we work with private landowners, local governments, tribes, and others across the landscape, not just on national forest system lands. And a lot of that is money that comes from Congress and then goes out as grants to local entities to help with a range of landscape scale objectives, whether it's fire or insect and disease issues, advice to private landowners, et cetera, is included in that program. And then I also oversee our fire and aviation program, which includes the fire suppression component, as well as the restoration and prescribed fire component. And a lot of similar comments as Michael made around, we have a lot to learn. You know, we have to start making shifts to get these landscapes back to a more resilient state. And we have a lot to learn from a range of partners in the tribes, and really look forward to being a partner in this rather than being the lone expert, which we are not. So really looking forward to today and the dialogue and learning from all of you as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. And finally, Margot.
Ayakui, Nicknell Marge Robbins, Keechneck, Yurok tribal member, co-founder and executive director of the Cultural Fire Management Council, which is a small nonprofit organization located in far northern California on the Yurok Reservation. I'm also co-founder and co-lead of the Indigenous Peoples Burn Network, whose goal is to expand traditional burn practices out to other tribes throughout the United States. We have been burning for 8 years on the Upper Yurok Reservation, very steep, very fuel-loaded territory rated as extreme risk by CAL FIRE. And we have had no escapes in 8 years. We have adapted traditional burn practices to fit this changed landscape that we now live in since the fire suppression era. I'm really happy to be here with all of you, and well, I can all learn from each other. Thank you.
Thank you, Margot. So we thought we would kick off the panel today with just trying to orient ourselves. When we were planning this call yesterday, I was sort of noticed from a number of our panelists just the observation that the term cultural burning for many folks is relatively new. I know that may not be the case for many of our tribal participants on this call, but for agency folks, there really has been an uptick in interest and in media coverage and policy work to increase cultural burning, but we might not know what exactly that means, and we may have different definitions of that. So I wanted to start our conversation just by talking about what we mean when we say cultural burning. And I wanted to note one change that we recently saw in state law in California. So with this recent legislative session, folks, including the Karuk tribe, Margot was involved in this effort as well, pushed to have a precise definition of cultural burning included in California's Public Resources Code. That's now found in section 4002.4. And the definition that we came up with was that it means the intentional application of fire to land by California Native American tribes, tribal organizations, or cultural fire practitioners to achieve cultural goals or objectives, including for subsistence, ceremonial activities, biodiversity, or other benefits. And I wanted to note just a couple of observations about this particular language before we get into a broader discussion about what cultural burning means for both our tribal practitioner on the line as well as our agency folks. So first off, who is doing the burning in this definition is broad. It includes both California Native American tribes, which in California includes both federally recognized tribes as well as state recognized tribes, which is a broader subset. It includes tribal organizations, so organizations like the one that Margot runs, which may be incorporated as 501c3 organizations or otherwise. And it includes cultural fire practitioners who may be individuals with indigenous backgrounds, but who may or may not be members of or enrolled in tribes or tribal organizations. And so that's intentionally broad. The second thing that I wanted to note here is that it includes a non-comprehensive list of what a cultural goal or objective is. We have information around subsistence, ceremonial activity, and biodiversity, but it could include other benefits as well. And certainly, as Margot alluded to, there very well can be and may be intended to be community protection efforts included in that. The last point that I wanted to make is that this definition does not include a requirement about where these fires are taking place. There's no requirement that it's on tribal trust land or tribal fee land or within Indian country per se. It could be within the broader ancestral territory. But I wanted to open up a broader conversation with the group about what exactly cultural burning is and whether we should treat it as separate and apart from prescribed fire, or whether we should treat it as a subset of prescribed fire, or whether we should just consider these two to be sort of interchangeable terms. I have heard from folks in the non-native community that burning of ranch lands, for instance, does have cultural components. It's part of a cultural way of life in California. And so is that cultural burning? There may be different opinions on that, of course. But to start, I wanted to ask the question of if for agency folks, do your programs have room to consider cultural burning in a way that is separate from prescribed fire? Or is it just a subset of prescribed fire? And then for Margot in particular, I would love to hear her perspective, and maybe we'll start there with whether cultural burning is separate and apart from, or whether it is one and the same as prescribed fire. And maybe Margot, you could talk a little bit about the ways that it's both similar and different from the types of prescribed fire that agency folks are more accustomed to.
Thank you so much, Sarah. This is sort of a difficult task because we do several different kinds of cultural burns. We do the TREX model of cultural burning, where we have qualified firefighters, community members, and other people that come in and help us burn for cultural objectives. So we are choosing places that have a lot of different cultural species, whether it is for basket materials or medicine plants or foods. Those are the places that we're choosing to burn. And so to us, that makes it a cultural burn. Because we are using qualified firefighters and we have fire engines and hoses, you would not consider it a traditional burn, but because it is led by indigenous people in their own homelands for cultural objectives, that is a cultural burn. Another program that we have is a more traditional way of burning, and that is family burns. So when CAL FIRE lifts the burn restrictions, we're able to help families burn around their homes and gathering areas. We'll be out there in short pants and sandals, or however it is that people want to dress, all ages of people, from grandparents to little kids, 2-3 years old, learning how to burn. So that is a more traditional way of burning that we also do. And again, it is for cultural purposes, sometimes for home protection. So those are the kinds of cultural burns that we do. You know, not everybody would agree, but we have Forest Service, the Six Rivers Forest Service, that does some cultural burns. Now, it's a government agency, but the head of that forest is a native person, and that's in his homelands, and they're burning for basket materials. And I've been up there and I have gathered the bear grass that they burned. And so again, that is a cultural burn. Now, other forests, forests where the lead person is not of native descent, they are not getting guidance from the indigenous people of that area, and it's not led by native people, it would not be a cultural burn. But you know, it's still going to end up providing cultural resources for those of us who know where to go to look for them. So thank you.
Thank you, Margot. Let's see here. Perhaps I'll have Tony respond, given the mention of Forest Service right there.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great conversation. You know, when we talk about prescribed fire, at least within the federal government or the Forest Service, you know, usually we're thinking about predominantly one of two things. Either we're doing a burn to reduce fuels so that we can get the landscape back to a healthier state and reduce the potential for catastrophic fire. Or the other reason may be more around the biodiversity piece or forest management piece. So we do a mix of both. And so, you know, as the example was given on the Six Rivers, I believe that they can coincide together. They're not mutually exclusive. I think cultural burning can help us understand how to get better to a larger landscape. You know, what we talk about is broadcast burning. And a lot of people refer to that as more like cultural burning, where we need to be periodically burning large landscapes over a period of time, every 3 years, every 5 years, whatever the rotation is, so that those fuel conditions are always in a healthier state in case of a wildfire. And we think there's a lot of practices around cultural burning that we can learn from. And to be honest, we have struggled with our ability to get to that broader landscape, whether it's called cultural burning or broadcast burning, or it's a mix of both. We think there's lessons to be learned, partnerships to be discovered, and experiences to be found around that we have been struggling with. And one of the issues that we struggle with the most is we try to get biomass. When we have a lot of fuel, we try to first deal with biomass. So you hear about pile burning. Well, we spend a lot of time burning piles, and by the time we do that, we don't get to that broader landscape. So we've been really interested to learn from tribes of how have they used fire in a frequent manner over a larger area to keep a forest in a healthy, resilient condition, and how might we be able to adopt some of those practices. So, you know, really what we ask our local leaders is to engage directly with their tribes to, one, learn from their practices, and also find where that integration can be between the concept of cultural burning and some of the words or terms that we use around fuels reduction or biodiversity, because I think they're sometimes hand in hand. We just describe them differently based on our culture and experience. So that's been our goal, is to continue to find the middle ground and work together, because I think we can always, usually in every case, meet both objectives.
Great, thank you, Tony. Let's see here. Matthew, do you have any thoughts on the distinction here and whether there is one or whether there isn't one for CAL FIRE?
You know, we burn very similar to how Tony just described the way they burn at the Forest Service. You know, for us, I think when we talk about prescribed fire, we're talking about a very specific prescription, desired flame lengths, intensity, timing of year, wind speeds, all those things that come into the prescription that drive what that fire is going to do when you put it on the landscape. One of the things that is different that we generally are not considering in our burn plans are cultural objectives or cultural benefits. And I think Margot had a really good point that she said, even though it's not a traditional or a cultural burn, there still are benefits to cultural resources. And so when you start talking about that, I think the lines become even more blurred that, it would be good. And part of my interest of being here today and continuing to work with the tribes across the state is to be able to glean that information so that we understand what those cultural benefits are, how we are improving those cultural resources so that we can include those into our burn prescriptions. And a lot of it has to do with timing of year, when you're burning, like Tony was saying, we have largely focused our burning towards range improvement or fuel reduction and forest health. And we haven't, and most of that burning occurs in the springtime when the fuels are just starting to dry. Well, I know a lot of cultural burning occurs in the fall after the plants have had a chance to drop their seeds and you can kind of promote the desired species and so forth. So I just think we have a lot to learn here in this space. And I think you can draw a distinction if you're burning for fuels and forest health. Maybe you can start to say there's less of a cultural benefit there, but like Margot said, those cultural resources are benefiting. We might just not always understand what that is. And so I think that's the important message that I'm hearing here for me is that we need to be more cognizant of what those cultural benefits are when we put fire on the ground.
Great, thank you, Matthew. Maybe next I'll turn to Michael, and in particular, I know that there's some distinction between the NAAQS requirements and the regional haze rule, and whether you think that there's any difference between prescribed fire and cultural burning in the air quality and air regulatory spaces.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, this is a really great dialogue that we're having. CARB's focus, the Air Resources Board's focus, has always been on protecting public health. And in the case of fire, it's not preventing fire from happening on the landscape, but trying to figure out times when we can have fire on the landscape, but minimize exposure to smoke. So typically trying to identify those days when the meteorology is conducive to burning. And I think what we're finding is that is in some cases a challenge in terms of thinking about when can that burning happen from a resource, a weather, a logistics perspective. But I think what's really useful about the dialogue today is also thinking about the cultural aspects and how do we consider the needs of tribes. And honestly, I don't know to what extent we've really done that. And I think there's an opening here for us to really engage, to learn and to listen. And we see this as the beginning of a more open dialogue with the tribes about how to incorporate having more cultural burning and how to build that into the current framework that we have in place right now with the land management agencies, as well as with our partners at the local air districts.
Great, thank you, Michael. Anything to add, Denise?
I'm in the middle of something. You just said.
Just noting that, EPA recognizes the importance of prescribed fires in reducing the impacts of the catastrophic wildfires. And so while the exceptional event rule doesn't call out cultural burning, it might be, could be seen as a subset of prescribed fires if it meets the criteria for requesting those emissions to be excluded. So it's really, I would have to go back, with the attorneys and ask them, can we see it fitting in here? But I can, at the staff level, see it fitting in here if it meets the criteria for the prescribed burns. And from what I'm hearing, and it's a great discussion because I am learning a lot about it, that it could potentially do that.
Great. Thank you, Denise. And I tend to agree, having looked at the exceptional event rule. In some ways, it's just a matter of taking a cultural burn and describing it in the terms that EPA uses.
Right.
Although you then get into the question about the exceptional events rule and how difficult it may be to actually use it for some prescribed fires, especially smaller ones.
Yeah. Well, for one thing,
ahead.
that the exceptional events program is when you have exceedances. And so since I've been the lead for the program, we have yet to see a prescribed fire, a demonstration for prescribed fire submitted, but primarily I think because the whole idea is not to have those, incredible emissions from the wildfires. So it's really on a smaller scale. It's very managed, and in that way, I don't think we are seeing exceedances from the prescribed fires.
Great, thank you. Okay, we're going to turn to our next question, and I'm going to frame it up by talking a little bit about some of the movement we've seen in California over this last legislative session. And I just want to quickly highlight 3 changes to state law that we're hoping will help increase cultural burning. The first is the piece that I talked about, really just setting definitional ideas into state law and codifying that so we can start to build this conversation into the permitting and regulatory structures. The second is a change in California's liability standard for escaped burns, and in particular for the costs that prescribed burners and cultural burners may have to pay to CAL FIRE in the event they need additional suppression support. And there is a switch from that being a simple negligence standard to a gross negligence standard. And relevant to this discussion, I think I just wanted to note that cultural burns are talked about specifically in that language and given some additional leeway. No prescribed burn plan is required and no certified burn boss is required in order to qualify for that gross negligence standard if the fire is done by a cultural burner. And the reason for that is just a recognition, as Margot talked about in this sort of family burning context, that you may not have those things when cultural burns are being done, and we wanted to ensure that those were covered. The third state policy that I just wanted to briefly mention relates to a new insurance pool. So one of the big issues in California for both cultural burners and prescribed burners in the private sector is that most folks have lost their insurance coverage and haven't been able to get that to engage in fire activities. And the state has recently stepped in to form a pilot program of state-backed insurance pool. And I just want to again mention that Native American tribes are specifically called out as eligible to participate in that pilot program. But knowing that we are not done by any means in expanding cultural burning and getting to the sort of level of getting good fire back on the ground that we need to be at, I would love to turn to the question of what state and federal agencies are doing to enable greater cultural burning and what more needs to be done. And I'll probably just take these questions in the same order. So I'll hand the floor over to Margot first to see, from your perspective, Margot, what more could be done to enable greater conditions for cultural burning on the ground?
Thank you, Sarah. So I would like to just return for a moment back to the California Air Quality Resource Board and the goal to protect public health, and looking at that in terms of when we can have fire on the landscape. And I think we need to really think hard about that, because we cannot dictate when we can have fire on the landscape. Wildfire is an unruly beast, and it's getting bigger, more intense, and spreading more and more, and affecting air quality more and more. So the fact of the matter is, we are going to have smoke. We can choose to have the unmeasured amounts of toxic smoke from wildfires, or we can choose to have the limited amounts of smoke from cultural and prescribed burns, which go away in the night. And it's only wood smoke. It's not plastic and other poisons going up into the air. I think that wildfire smoke should be measured. I don't think it is an exceptional event. How many wildfires do we have every year? They're no longer exceptional. And the other part of the definition is that it will not happen again in that place, which is also a fallacy. Because if you look at those mountains and mountains of dead trees standing up and the results of plant growth in those areas that have been burned, they come back thick with brush, super thick. So now we have dead standing trees and thick brush, and you can bet that there is going to be another wildfire there. I think that we need to exempt cultural burns from the air quality standards, that they should be recognized as part of the baseline emissions. Fire is meant to be part of the ecosystem, not the big raging wildfires we're experiencing now, but more like the controlled burns that Native people have been doing for thousands of years. Not only is fire supposed to be part of the ecosystem, but humans are supposed to be part of the ecosystem as well. We need to reestablish our connection with wildfire and reestablish our place in the ecosystem and take our responsibility seriously about bringing it back to health. And we need to look at the different air quality regulations and other rules that are stopping that from taking place. Some recommendations are to amend the Federal Clean Air Act to explicitly recognize cultural burning as part of the natural baseline conditions for both national ambient air quality and regional haze. In terms of CAL FIRE, we need to eliminate the availability of CAL FIRE standby fire protection as a factor for consideration for providing a permit. If a permittee has sufficient contingency resources, the permit should be issued. And we need to also eliminate wildfire risk in other parts of the state as a factor of consideration for given CAL FIRE permits. We need to amend the Public Resources Code to allow CAL FIRE notification in lieu of permits for cultural burns and specific types of prescribed burns, including burns for ecological maintenance. So those are some of the recommendations, and I hope that they answered your question.
Thank you, Margot. Well, given that we got some directives to some of our fellow agency folks on the line, I'll perhaps first turn to Michael and see if you want to tackle some of the air quality issues that Margot raised.
Absolutely. So Margot's really raised some great points, and I want to start by saying that the Air Resources Board is really committed to working with the tribes and with other partners on how to get more fire back on the landscape in order to enable us to have healthier forests, to avoid catastrophic wildfires and the smoke that comes with those fires, which Margot points out is much worse than the fires that or the smoke that we experience from prescribed fires or cultural burns. And so that's a really good point. The framework under which the Air Resources Board has been operating and is really required to operate is in some cases limited by federal law. And Margot referenced the Clean Air Act, the Federal Clean Air Act. And so some of the policies and regulations that we've adopted over time have been in response to those federal requirements. We do have smoke management guidelines that we've developed, and we're actually in the process of going back and looking at those smoke management guidelines. And I think that this is an excellent time actually for us to go back and look at those in light of some of the things that we're hearing today in terms of our understanding of the importance of cultural burning. I think the relationships that we've established and with the land management agencies and the tribes, I think there's really an opportunity for us to rethink how we go about the permitting process. And so I think, at least from my perspective, this is really the beginning of a new dialogue that we can have, and maybe a new way of looking at how we should be administering and thinking about cultural burning across California. So I see this as an opportunity, and recognizing at the same time that there is a legacy of preventing the types of burning that's important, not just for the landscape, but also for tribal cultures and practices. So I acknowledge that and recognize that changes are needed.
Thank you, Michael. Denise, I would love to hear your response on this sort of definitional challenge we see with the exceptional events rule, and certainly this change in wildfire that we're seeing in California. It does appear that unfortunately wildfires are no longer exceptional here, and perhaps we're seeing a weighing of wildfire versus prescribed fire that's not aligned under the Clean Air Act in terms of motivation. Thoughts on that?
Well, I do, chairing the work group for the EPA regions, and I know that Region 9 in particularly has seen a deluge of exceptional event demonstrations for the wildfires. And so we are seeing that over the past few years. We're not yet, this year's continuing to be a severe wildfire season as well. The exceptional events program is kind of walled off. It's a discrete thing of where air agencies can request this data to be excluded, and the definitions that are in there with regards to what is an exceptional event. It can, and I understand, I guess you're saying that a wildfire is not necessarily a natural event anymore, or it's not a human event unlikely to recur. So I think that, it would take a change maybe in the regulations, changing the Clean Air Act. Getting an amendment is substantial. And but I do think that we could see these cultural burns within the construct of the exceptional events program.
Great, thank you, Denise. Matthew, I would love to hear your thoughts in responding on the permitting issues from CAL FIRE. I would also just note there were some questions in the chat that sort of tie in here about CAL FIRE implementing or having requirements around prescriptions and needing to show a prescription or prescribed burn plan for to get a CAL FIRE permit, and how that may be in tension with cultural burning practices. I'd love to hear your thoughts on those issues.
Yeah, so, and I should explain, there are really two ways that the department engages with fire. One of them is through the issuance of permits, in which by statute, we go out, we do an inspection, we evaluate the intended burn. Sometimes there's a burn permit requirement, sometimes not. It really depends on the type of burn, the complexity, where it is, and it comes down to working with the landowner or the burn proponent and kind of coming to some general agreement on how that burn can safely be implemented. By statute, when we're issuing a permit, as Margot indicated, we can provide standby resources. That isn't defined, but essentially what that means to us is we can be there and available should should there be a need for assistance, but ultimately we can't conduct the burn ourselves under those circumstances. We did have, or I should back up, we're in the process of making those permits online, so where you can go online, you can log in, it will start generating the permit for you. And I will recognize that we need to be more consistent in the issuance of those permits. We do have 21 different units across the state. Obviously, conditions are different all over the state at any given time. But the way we condition those permits, the way we work with landowners, especially now within the context of cultural burning, where we have legislation now telling us that we need to work with those cultural burn practitioners. And I think what it's going to come down to is just some education on our behalf of the department on what cultural burning is, If there's not a need for a burn permit or a prescription, it's in having a common understanding on what the objectives are of that burn, so that we can have confidence. And it's a matter of communication and relationship building. And my hope is that as we move forward, now that we are going online with our burn permits, we're doing a lot of work in that space to try to build our consistency. My hope is that those relationships are building at the field level, and things will become more efficient as we move forward with the issuance of those permits. I will say that we had 2000, I think it was 19, we had SB 1260, and that was some legislation that went through that provided our department the opportunity to share liability on burns cooperatively. Prior to that, we didn't have that ability. So when we would step into a burn or a project, we would just assume all liability. That often put us in the position to where we were administering the burn solely with our resources. And now that we can share that liability, cooperatively burning, we can bring resources to the table, but still allow those cultural burn practitioners or those private burners to lead the burn, and we can just provide resources to help support it so that it can be done in a safe fashion. I think Margot's comments are spot on. We can be more consistent, and we are working towards that. And my hope is that right now, locally, we can start to build those relationships. And it's not just with cultural burning, it's with all prescribed fire. Even a lot of the private burn associations, we're building those relationships as well, so that we have that confidence. It's a bit of a cultural shift in our department, to be honest with you. We're real good at putting fire out. We've had a lack of institutional knowledge over the years in prescribed fire. It wasn't 15 years ago where we were only burning 2,000 acres a year, and most of that was grass for range improvement. Historically, we burned 40,000 acres a year. But my point being is that we've lost a lot of institutional knowledge in prescribed fire as well. And so we're trying to build our knowledge. And I think, having the opportunity to work with the tribes across the state here is a great first step. We've been working with the Natural Resource Agency. The department, as well as state parks, are getting ready to enter a consultation process that agency is leading statewide with various tribes. And so we're looking forward to gleaning that information through the consultation process to improve the way we go about doing our business around prescribed fire and cultural burning. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Great. Thank you, Matthew. There's a quick question in the chat about CAL FIRE permits, on whether permits are required on reservation lands. I wondered if you could answer that.
That's a really great question. And I was just speaking with our attorneys about that this morning. I think it would be similar to federal lands. These are sovereign lands, and I don't think jurisdictionally they would be. That's kind of the quick answer I got this morning. Before I would want to definitively, that is the steadfast rule. I'd want to circle back with them, but the quick answer I got this morning was they didn't think so.
Margo. Go ahead.
So yes, on the Yurok Reservation, the BIA has ceded permitting authority and fire suppression authority over to CAL FIRE. And so we're required to get a permit from CAL FIRE. And also, as a point of interest, many reservations, ours included, are not completely owned by the tribe. On our reservation, 10 years ago, we only owned 3% of it. And now we're up to like 12%. And the rest is privately owned landowners.
Yeah, I wish we had, thanks, Margo. I wish we had a BIA representative here. There's a chatter in the chat about BIA, and I understand from a number of different tribes the difficulties with BIA in navigating how to get fire done in Indian country. Let's see here. First, I just want to note, if you have questions, put them in the chat. We should have about 10 minutes at the end to go through them. But I did want to give Tony an opportunity to jump in on this question about what the Forest Service is doing to enable greater cultural burning, or what more could be done.
Yeah, at least in the current framework, there's a lot of similarities to CAL FIRE. one, with law and policy, when it comes to burning on national forests, we always have to do National Environmental Policy Act compliance. That'll include coordination with Fish and Wildlife Service when it comes to Endangered Species Act, as well as with the State Historic Preservation Office on cultural resources. And once we kind of clear that hurdle, then we have to develop a prescribed burning plan. Now that plan can include cultural objectives. And so I always look at it as whether it's prescribed fire or whatever word you want to put on it. To me, it's simply doing a burn in a controlled manner to meet any objective. It doesn't have to be fuels reduction. It doesn't even have to be forest management. It could solely be for cultural purposes. So I think we will still have to have a burn plan with objectives and with a prescription. And that prescription is one to comply with the range of federal laws that Michael and others mentioned, and also to reduce the potential for escape. And we're never going to be able to avoid that unless someone else decides to change those laws. And so I always look at it as we can either continue to look at those as an impediment, or we can look at how to overcome those barriers. If someone wants to change those things, they can, but until they do, when it comes to certifications, training, we have resources to partner with tribes and others on overcoming those hurdles. And so some of the things we're excited about, there's two pending bills right now. One is the National Prescribed Fire Act that's in committee in Congress. One, it reduces liabilities for tribal entities when they're assisting us with burning. It does allow for some exemptions when there's burns that are over 1,000 acres. It increases funding for large scale and landscape scale fires. And the other thing that's really important is we're looking at establishing training centers throughout the state. Right now, at least that I know of, the only prescribed fire training center in the entire United States is in Florida. And so we've been talking about how do we create that environment within California and the Western states so that we can be together with tribes and partners and agencies and learn together, develop skills together, train together, and overcome some of the things that we consider to be hurdles. But actually, they don't need to be if we all kind of row in the same motion. So that's where we've been trying to invest in. If we do have to require certifications, what can we do to help tribal members and others get those certifications rather than have that be an excuse where we can't work together in the same space? And really, that's some of the stuff that they've done on the 6 rivers. The other thing that we're excited about is the Infrastructure and Investment Jobs Act, waiting to see what happens with that. That includes $400 million for fuels reduction, I think $500 million for community wildfire defense grants, and then $200 million for state and tribal projects when it comes to restoration on the landscape. So, I think it's continuing the conversation around how do we work together when it comes to cultural burning on National Forest System lands so that those aren't barriers, and then also building the training, the concepts together. And really what we've learned is when we sit down and we talk about those barriers, we usually find solutions. If we're not talking and we're not communicating and we don't have good relationships, then people are finding them as reasons not to get something done. And we own that too. The issue that was brought up around why can't we burn in Northern California if there's a fire in Southern California? That's been frustrating to people. Well, us too, like the past 2 years, we didn't used to have a problem where we didn't have enough resources in Southern California to deal with fires in Southern California. Well, right now there's so much fire in California, it takes firefighters from across the United States to deal with the amount of fire that we had. And so a lot of resources that used to be there locally for contingency, to work with partners and deliver those prescribed burns aren't there anymore. And so it leaves us at risk when it comes to escapes and other factors. And so I think we have some really big challenges to overcome, but we're not going to do it if we don't do it together. So, we're in the same boat as everyone else is. The fire problem we have is bigger than any one of us. We're not going to deal with it by ourselves, and we are not the sole experts in how to solve it. So that's going to be our approach moving forward.
Thank you, Tony. So we're almost at time. I wanted to wrap up on one last question along these same themes about working together and being more collaborative. We had a question in the chat about how many members on the California Air Resources Board are Native Americans or Indigenous people, and I think that'd be directed to Michael, but I'm going to expand that question and just ask for folks to go around really quickly and indicate how tribal members or tribes can get involved with your agencies. Where are the places for these conversations to continue? So Michael, I'll turn it over to you to answer that specific question, and then see if everyone wants to offer in 30 seconds or less where folks might get involved. Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, so I can't speak for different board members' cultural backgrounds. My sense is that there are no tribal representatives on ARB's board. But I think certainly our board has become much more diverse over time, and we are very much engaged with talking with representatives of communities across the state, including tribal members. And so we're very open to having that dialogue and figuring out how to make sure that diverse voices are heard and reflected in the policies that we adopt.
Great, thank you. Let's go to Denise. Where can tribes get involved in your programs?
Well, we have in the Office of Air Quality Planning and Standards the Community and Tribal Programs Group, which is in the in OID, which is a Communication and Outreach Division. And through that group, we will engage with NTAA and other tribal organizations and to communicate our, the rules and how it might impact the tribes and how they might provide input to us. And so that is an excellent place to start, is the Community and Tribal Programs Group.
Great, thank you. Tony, what about Forest Service?
Sarah, I had a little glitch there in my audio. Can you repeat that question?
Oh, yes. If tribes want to get more involved with cultural burning at the Forest Service, what's the best place for them?
I think, the connection with local leadership, our local forest supervisors and district rangers and their fire staff. And you got to start somewhere, right? I think that's what we've seen on the 6 rivers is it didn't happen overnight. It's probably been years in the making to get to that point. And there's still things that aren't perfect where we have disagreement and we got to work through it. So one, I think it's connecting at that local level with the local staff. They're looking to learn and they're looking to do more on the landscape. And I think they're open to it. And that's been our expectation of them. And then I think, as Matthew said, we have to take serious when we think about some of the groups we have, the committees we have at a statewide level. We do have good representation from the agencies, but we need to incorporate, participation from tribal leadership so that we can build from the state level and the regional level all the way down to the local level so that we're interconnected as we do this, and that we own that. And so that's something that I'm going to take back, is looking at the groups that we have that discuss this type of work and saying, do we have the right representation on that to really fully do this? So we'll take that back as something for us to follow up on. But at least for anyone on the call, connecting with local leadership and local folks is a good first start.
Great. Matthew?
Yeah, similar to what Tony mentioned, we have at the field level, we have 21 units, and each of those units is constantly in development of projects at any given time. And we are following the California Environmental Quality Act, which is a notification and outreach to make sure that we're protecting resources, cultural resources being one of them. So at the project level, we are notifying the local tribes. We're trying to work with the local tribes. So that would be an opportunity for tribes within their ancestral territories to be able to reach out at the project level. At the state level, we have a Native American Advisory Council. And this is a 9-member council of various tribal members that represent different geographical areas of the state. And so this is a council that provides direction to our department on policies and procedures and ways that we can better interact and support tribes. One thing to remember with CAL FIRE is the majority of our jurisdiction is private land, with the exception of about 70,000 acres of the state forest program, which we directly manage. Most of the lands we're dealing with are privately owned. So my point being is that a lot of those projects are crossing multiple different landowners. We do have a cultural resource program that is out there doing cultural resource surveys. Those are all opportunities for us to be able to engage with tribes and get their insight as to how we can protect those resources. The last thing I'll mention, and I mentioned it earlier, is we are in the process of working with the Natural Resource Agency to engage with a consultation statewide with tribes in order to improve access to our state forest system, as well as to be able to consult more readily on other items like the Wildfire and Forest Resilience Task Force. Sarah, I know you're very familiar with it, the prescribed fire strategic plan that's being developed. Being able to consult with the tribes on items like that, I think, are going to be really important. So, yeah, I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you. And finally, over to Margot. I'd love to hear any words of wisdom or advice for our agency folks about how to effectively engage with tribes and tribal members on these topics.
I would just like to say that we actually have a really great relationship with CAL FIRE and the North Coast Air Quality Resources Board up here. Took a while, a few years, but as we got to know each other, it made a huge difference. And I just appreciate that we're all here working together to bring good fire back to the land. And the better we understand each other and the more often we're able to work together, the better we'll get, the more we'll be able to increase the pace and scale. So thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you to all our participants here today. We really appreciate it. Thank you to our panelists. I think this was a really excellent conversation. And I encourage you to reach out. Certainly if folks have questions on my end that I can help answer, I'd be happy to engage with folks. There's a lively discussion in the chat. But I appreciate your time and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.